Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to Arundel House. I think we have another 300 people joining us online. Today, we are publishing the Military Balance 2022 and delivering conclusions from our Military Balance Plus database in a year that is characterized by significant risk of large-scale military conflict. In their different ways, the key challenger states, Russia, Iran, and China, are deploying force to shape their strategic environment in ways that have caused regional concern and alarm. Future defense technology and capability concerns will increasingly be shaped by the need to integrate military capabilities across the land, sea, air, and cyber domains, and also by developments in agility, speed, and range of the sort that are particularly useful in the Asia-Pacific theater. China's military modernization and the way it is looking to harness technological and industrial progress to national security priorities will continue to make China the so-called pacing challenge for the United States. Nonetheless, within this overall trend, concerns about Russia's military power are acute now, as Moscow has concentrated forces and equipment close to Ukraine for the second time in a year. The spread of weapons to state and non-state actors, including cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and armed UAVs, are also a key preoccupation. Moscow continues to deny it has plans to invade Ukraine, but similar denials were, of course, reported in 2014. What is clear is that Russia has given itself a range of military options should it decide to act. Russia's armed forces are different to those that fought the short war with Georgia in 2008. Its troops are now mostly contract personnel, not conscripts, while its weapons, including its nuclear arsenal, are on the whole more modern. Its cruise missiles, such as the air-launched Kha-101 or sea-launched Caliber, can strike from ranges over 2,000 kilometers. The ballistic and cruise missiles that can be used by the Iskander-M system can also strike from range. There are effective layered and mobile air defense systems and an increasingly modern air force. Large-scale exercises, snap drills, and overseas missions have been used to test personnel and equipment. Less progress may have been made in modernizing army equipment, but Russia's ground maneuver capabilities are nonetheless superior to those of Ukraine. The forces that Russia has assembled near Ukraine and in Belarus include over half of Moscow's battalion tactical groups. Equipment and units observed include armored vehicles, rocket artillery, and short-range ballistic missiles, as well as the air mobility, logistics, and medical units that would be called on during combat and after. Russia's buildup has so far been slow and methodical, with much of it visible to a global audience. Moscow will likely intend any military strike to be fast. However, one risk for Moscow, depending on the path of any attack, relates to the level of resistance from Ukraine's armed forces and a population already resentful of Russia's actions in Crimea and in Ukraine's eastern regions since 2014. Reported movements by elements of Russia's National Guard are noteworthy, as these are units tasked with internal security duties. It is unlikely that Russia has yet assembled the forces necessary to invade, subdue, and occupy the entire country successfully, even if this were Moscow's objective. That said, Moscow has a wide range of tools at its disposal. These include gray zone capacities, including in particular in cyberspace. However, should Russia decide to attack, there's probably enough combat mass now present to conduct a more limited ground operation, perhaps to seize Ukraine's eastern regions, or to conduct standoff strikes across the country using precision missiles or a combination of the two. Such missiles launched from well within Russian territory could also be employed along with ground maneuver forces as part of an integrated air-ground campaign. Now, concerns over Russia's military capabilities and possible actions have been important in motivating European states in the last year to increase defense spending. In 2021, European defense spending grew by 4.8% in real terms, the fastest pace recorded by any region for this year. This marked the 7th consecutive year of real term growth in Europe. The 2021 increase was primarily driven by the UK, but there were also notable budget increases in Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, and the Netherlands. However, despite heightened threat perceptions on NATO's eastern flank, the 2022 outlook for European spending is less favorable. So far, there is no sign that defense budgets will rise significantly in 2022, while widespread and high rates of inflation will again affect spending in real terms. Across the world, defense spending was 3.4% higher in 2021 than the previous year, but higher inflation in all regions meant this amounted to a 1.8% reduction in real terms. There were real-term spending contractions in all regions, bar Asia and Europe. In real terms, spending in Latin America is at the same level as in 2009, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the same as in 2012. Asian defense spending was more resilient. Total spending there in 2021 amounted to $488 billion US, more than double the 2008 total of $226 billion US. China accounted for 43% of total defense spending in Asia in 2021, with an official defense budget of $207 billion US, supporting Beijing's military modernization. China continues to modernize its armed forces and to exercise its capabilities, including close to Taiwan. From January to November 2021, the PLA conducted 230 incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. These included fighters and bombers, but also electronic warfare and other special mission aircraft, as well as transport and attack helicopters. This has led to concern that China is both testing Taiwan's responses and also exercising capabilities that could be useful in any cross-strait contingency. China's military modernization has also been evident in the remarkable and rapid transformation of its Navy. Our database shows that just under 50 Type 056 and 056A corvettes have been launched since 2015, strengthening littoral capacity. The commissioning in 2021 of 2 aviation-capable amphibious assault ships, continuing aircraft carrier development, and the introduction of new, better-armed cruisers, destroyers, and frigates reflects important efforts to develop a blue water navy. In future, China's naval power will be seen more often and further from China's shores. The same can be said for some of the weapons China has developed. For several years, the IISS has been tracking exports of Chinese military equipment. Uninhabited aerial vehicles, UAVs, have been a key element of China's sales drive, with systems such as the Wing-Long weapons-capable UAV appearing in the inventories of both Middle Eastern and African armed forces. China's UAV sales, including to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, grew in part because its systems were cheaper, but also because it was not a signatory to the Missile Technology Control Regime with its voluntary restrictions on UAV exports. Armed UAV systems are in the inventories of at least 20 countries, while others are seeking to acquire these systems. These range from small hobbyist-style systems employed by some non-state groups to large, long-range platforms capable of being fitted with sensors and air-to-surface weapons. The challenge of defending against UAVs will only intensify as they evolve, the latest test being the emergence of hybrid systems, which combine the characteristics of a UAV and of an air-to-surface weapon. Armed UAVs are no longer the exception. They are rapidly becoming the norm. The reported appearance of small, as yet unidentified UAVs over Swedish nuclear power plants in January 2022 and attacks in the UAE in the same month indicate the growing risk to civilian infrastructure as well as to military targets. The UAE attacks carried out by Yemen's Houthi rebels against oil and aviation facilities also highlight how the distribution of these UAV capabilities to non-state actors can be a tool of state policy. In this case, for Iran, a key supporter of the Houthis. Iran has previously transferred UAV capabilities to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to the Syrian government, and Iran has also transferred ballistic and cruise missiles, including to the Houthis. Iran's actions have been an important factor in encouraging its Middle Eastern neighbors to procure military systems and to work closely with the US on developing missile defense and other capabilities. Tehran's policies gave impetus to the Abraham Accords, and there is now potential for increased military and security contacts between some Gulf states and Israel. In this regard, there are similarities with reactions to China and Russia's policies in Asia and Europe. In these regions, Chinese and Russian policies are prompting new geopolitical alignments, closer military cooperation, and accelerated capability development. A notable trend has been the use of so-called minilateral security arrangements assembled to achieve limited, if significant, strategic objectives and to be more agile than existing larger and more formal international security organizations. There is rightly focus now on Russia's military activity, and this has led to procurements in European armed forces and renewed attention among NATO states on capabilities like anti-submarine warfare. However, longer-term defense trends will be shaped by the implications of China's military modernization and the spread of Chinese military technology abroad, as well as UAVs, combat aircraft, and other equipment. China is now offering for export increasingly capable air-to-air missiles. Like Russia and the US, China is developing more precise, long-range, and high-speed weapons and is investing in high-technology systems. Indeed, a problem for defending forces is the sheer variety of threat systems that can now be employed by some state and non-state actors, including high, low, fast, and slow weapons. If these are coordinated, as in recent Houthi attacks, the challenge is sharper still. Responding effectively places a premium not only on layers of defensive weapons, but also on the costly sensors, systems, and computing power needed to effectively address these threats. Not all states will be able to afford investments either in these weapons or in the systems needed to counter them. Of course, as the military capabilities of states and non-state actors continue to develop, the IISS will continue itself to deliver balanced and independent assessments of the global defense environment that will be relevant to the interests of our three main constituencies in government, business, and analytical communities. Before we take questions and answers, I might just invite some of our IISS colleagues to add some specialist points on 5 issues. First, Fenella McGurty, our defense economist, on how inflation is eating defense budget growth in several regions of the world. Fenella.
Okay. Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. So as John said, I would like to touch on that theme of inflation that's wiping out real terms increases, nominal increases in real terms across the world at the moment. So of the about 3/4 of the 171 countries that we examine in the military balance saw an increase in inflation, some with quite significant spikes in 2021. And that is, as I say, wiping out budget growth in real terms, but it's also creating pressure within defense budgets if it persists for too long. If you see then for certain countries around the world that have quite high rates of inflation, that can have an erosive effect on defense spending. It creates pressure within it and means that you have to focus on those higher cost factor inputs, perhaps a higher wage demands. So if inflation doesn't abate in the next year or so, then it will start to squeeze other areas of spending, so perhaps R&D or modernization. So already in 2021, we had that impact at the global level. In recent years, we've seen high inflation erode spending in perhaps the more emerging markets or emerging regions, but actually in 2021, we saw it happen in the US. which was a primary driver of growth in 2020, the US defense budget, because we saw an uptick in O&M spending, operations and maintenance, and military construction. But that wasn't repeated in 2021. And when you combine that with the spike in inflation in the US, then you end up with a real terms cut in the US defense budget, and that's obviously going to affect the global trend. So the high inflation rates did mean that regional spending contracted in all regions bar Europe and Asia. The resilience of Asian defense budgets did continue in 2021, and actually growth was really bolstered by a late uplift in the Japanese defense budget, which was announced in November 2021 and then approved in December. So what we then might see for the outlook for 2022 is that if that uplift isn't maintained or repeated, then that's going to slightly skew the Asian trend as well. And in terms of Europe, the increase that we saw in defense spending in 2021 there, it did mean that Europe maintained defense expenditure as a proportion of GDP. So in 2020, we expected all regions to spike in this measure just because of the economic contractions. And then you would expect in 2021, when recoveries happen in real GDP, then you would expect the proportion to decrease. But Europe was the only region that didn't, because the increase was so significant in defense spending. And just in terms of the European outlook, as John alluded to, the official budgets as announced so far point to quite a flat outlook for European defense spending. The surge that we saw this year is either being maintained or not repeated. So as it currently stands, inflation would likely wipe out growth in European defense spending next year. But as the security situation develops, European countries may revise their budgets and look to shore them up to fund other capabilities that might be needed in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Doug Barry, maybe on UAVs and the implication of recent attacks.
Thanks, John. As John noted in his opening statement, armed uninhabited aerial vehicles are rapidly becoming the norm. China was in the vanguard of offering such systems for export, adopting a transactional approach to the sale, and Turkey is now following suit. Russia, meanwhile, is also trying to catch up in introducing armed UAVs into its inventory. The current generation of systems are of value, particularly when used against limited or no air defence. Mirroring the state-level adoption of armed UAVs, non-state groups are also increasingly exploiting such systems in the attack role. This is evident, obviously, in the civil war in the Yemen and the attacks on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We've seen the emergence of a subclass of UAV, if you like, a kind of Costco or Poundland cruise missile, where a comparatively simple air vehicle is fitted with a warhead and either inertial or satellite navigation, but no terminal seeker. It keeps the cost down, it makes it simpler, but it does provide the ability to attack area targets, such as an oil installation or an airfield. Now, the propaganda value of such attacks generally far outweighs any damage actually achieved. In the Yemen war, the use of what are sometimes called lethal UAVs or direct attack munitions has on occasion been carried out in concert with ballistic and cruise missile attacks. Such coordination complicates the task of defending against such an attack, because you've got to identify, track and engage targets across a broad range of altitudes and speed regimes. For air defenders, this is already a wicked problem, and it's one that is only likely to become yet more demanding. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Mayor Nguyen's our Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization. Maybe a few words on China, Taiwan.
Thank you very much, John. So as John noted in his speech, in 2021, we saw a continued focus on PLA training and exercises aimed at a possible Taiwan contingency. Between January and November 2021, we saw 230 air incursions into Taiwan's ADs made by nearly 900 PLA aircraft. While earlier air incursions in 2021 were primarily conducted by the PLA Air Force and the PLA Navy's aircraft, in late 2021, incursions started to include PLA Ground Forces aviation aircraft as well, such as the inclusion of combat and transport helicopters. The flight paths of these incursions were largely focused on the Bashi Channel to the south of Taiwan's main island, and at most flew upwards along the southeast coast of Taiwan main island. In addition to the heavy rotation of anti-submarine and special mission aircraft, this suggests that the PLA's flights serve multiple purposes. Firstly, to practice the PLA's capabilities in areas such as anti-submarine warfare capabilities, but also other skills such as operating a heavy rotation of aircraft, both during daytime and nighttime, sometimes multiple times per day, all of which are still a work in progress for the PLA's various branches. Secondly, to judge the ROC's armed forces' ability to respond to these incursions, and relatedly to put a heavy financial and maintenance cost on the ROC's Air Force by forcing frequent responses. And lastly, these incursions also, of course, serve political purposes that we have to keep in mind, allowing Beijing to signal discontent to Taiwanese and American audiences, but also, of course, to other countries friendly to Taiwan, such as Japan, whilst also signaling, and we shouldn't forget this, strength to its own domestic population as well. The AD's incursions aren't, of course, the only exercises that the PLA conducts around Taiwan. In 2021, we saw the PLA held numerous joint exercises in its Eastern Theater and Southern Theater Command, both single exercise and joint service exercises, naval exercises off Taiwan's east coast, and practicing the potential use of civilian ships to ferry military capabilities across the Taiwan Strait in the event of a contingency. Now, these exercises, whilst not signaling any imminent conflict, we think, across the Taiwan Strait, do allow the PLA to train in the skills needed for future contingencies, and of course, allow the PLA to improve its military capability gradually as well. And within this entire context, in the background, of course, in 2021, we saw two major changes to Chinese laws related to defense, the Chinese Coast Guard law, and of course, the National Defense Law, which allow the PLA to operate in a broader context as well moving forward. Thank you.
Maya, thank you very much. And coming back to the European theatre, James, maybe a couple of words on what military modernization has delivered for Russia in terms of capabilities that might be relevant today.
Thanks, John. It's worth, on the way out, having a look at the Russian military modernization dossier that we published a few years ago, because a lot of the capabilities that we reference in that hold true today and have been seen on many of the videos that have been circulating on social media, etc. Russia today is a more capable military power than at any time since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. At that time, directly afterwards, Russian forces suffered from a collapse in defense funding, a collapse in defense procurement, and deliveries were sharply reduced, and many projects were either cancelled or shelved. Shelved is the interesting point because a lot of them were then revived later on, and the force was conscript dominant. However, relatively poor performance in the late 2008 Georgia war helped give, importantly, political backing for reform processes. There had been earlier reform initiatives, but the backing hadn't been there either in political terms or in financial terms. But post-2008, it coincided with an improved economy that then enabled significant investment to take place and led to the new look military modernization process that was initially pioneered and led by Minister Serdikov. In the ground forces, contract personnel now outnumber conscripts. New equipment has arrived, but not in the numbers first envisaged. Many of you will remember the 2015 Victory Day parade when new equipment such as the T-14 tank, T-15 IFV, and Koalicja self-propelled gun were trailed as being a key deliverable of part of this military modernization process. What we're only seeing now is the Koalicja entering training units. The others are still in state test. There's been focus instead on modernizing platforms already in service and integrating more precise and longer-range weapons. The tank fleet's been modernized, but mainly by upgrading older systems like the T-72. Upgrades are also taking place to self-propelled artillery. Heavier artillery has also been modernized, driven in part by lessons from the 2014-15 activities in eastern Ukraine and the need for heavier artillery useful against fixed sites. A significant area of progress, however, has been, and we saw it on the slide earlier, in missile and rocket artillery. The 500-kilometer range Iskander M system has now replaced in Russia's missile brigades, the 120-kilometer Tochka-U, and rocket artillery system has been modernized throughout the force. Naval forces have also transformed. The introduction of the Caliber long-range land attack cruise missile on multiple surface and subsurface platforms means Moscow can now hold land-based infrastructure at risk from the sea. However, Russia's blue water capabilities remain more limited. The Air Force is capable and well equipped. Over the past decade, the Air Force has replaced most of its single-role fighters with multi-role fighter ground attack types. And the Air Force also has long-range standoff land attack capability. John referenced the Car 101 earlier. Lastly, the airborne forces remain a key component of Russia's high readiness capacity. They've received new personal equipment, and there's been some force experimentation, including exercises apparently looking to develop heliborne assault capability. With that, I'll end.
Thank you very much. And finally, Henry Boyd, a few comments on Russia's current posture and what to look for.
Thank you very much, John. As many of you may well have seen the press this morning, Russia now likely has around 100 battalion tactical groups deployed in and around Ukraine, plus support and enablers, with more reportedly on the way. It also has increasing numbers of fixed and rotary wing aircraft deployed to forward bases, both in Belarus and Western Russia, as well as a substantial National Guard presence. I think it's within this context that one should maintain an area of cautious skepticism about Russia's announcement this morning that they are now going to pull back troops from the southern and western military district and the completion of exercises. As has been noted already on this panel, there have been past discrepancies between Russia's official announcements and its actions on the ground. As recently as 5 years ago, I think this scale of mobilization would have been impossible for Russia's armed forces to achieve, and they simply didn't have the contract personnel or the modernized equipment on this for deployment on this scale. In overall numbers, the ground contingent is roughly equivalent to the maximum effort of Ukraine's ground forces, including its reserve formations at around 100 battalion equivalents. And I think it's important to reflect here that Russia's military advantage are in general here more qualitative than quantitative. The days of kind of the mass mobilization, endless Soviet army are dim and distant past. Exceptions to this rule, however, include some key areas that's been touched on, such as long-range fire support, late military warfare, and air power. Russia had the edge in both senses. I think I'd just conclude by referencing there is only one Russian army. It took them nearly a decade, over a decade, to build it to its current level of capability. The risk of spending this too freely in any kind of combat operation where it may well be needed elsewhere in the future for Russia, given the length of time it might take to rebuild such capabilities, I think will be strongly held in the minds of planners in Moscow. And it would be interesting to see over the coming days where this goes, I guess. And with that, I'll hand back to John.
Henry, thank you very much. So we kept that to exactly 28 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody. And it's open for questions, points from the floor, including from our online audience, but we give priority to those who come to visit us. So any questions from anybody here? Yes, please. The microphone will come straight to you. You could just give us.
Yes, Jonathan Beale from BBC. Just on Russia, just wanted to clarify. So the reports from both the US, other NATO countries, are that Russia now has enough troops to launch an invasion on multiple axes, but you seem to be saying that you don't think that is likely. If you could just clarify what you think Russia is up to, and I appreciate it's hard getting into the mind of President Putin, but just tell us why you think it is unlikely that Russia would mount a full-scale invasion. Thank you.
First Douglas Barry, and then maybe Henry and James. Douglas?
I think the challenge here is, one, as you mentioned, getting into the mind of President Putin is extraordinarily difficult, to say the least. Also, in terms of the challenge that the Russians face, ideally they want to avoid mass casualties on their side. If you look back at sort of Chechnya in the 1990s, the kind of fighting they got bogged down in, they want to try and avoid that. And I think, as Henry mentioned, arsenal depth is an issue as well, where they probably have enough weaponry for a short, sharp campaign, but actually an extended campaign would be extremely difficult for them.
And from the air to the ground, maybe Ben Barry?
Thanks, John. If war did break out, I think the Russians would make it seem like they were attacking on multiple axes. Some of that would be real, some of that would be Moskarovka, a mixture of OPSEC and deception. And although we've stated inhibitors for a Russian attack, the position that Ukraine defenders are in is really quite difficult. There's a vast frontier, they're surrounded, if you think of Ukraine as a clock face, from 10 o'clock right through to about 7 or 8 o'clock. And they're going to have to display a very, very high standard of operational art, training and tactical skill if a Russian all-out attack did happen.
Anything to add, Henry or James? Henry?
Just a quick. I think it's probably important to distinguish perhaps between a large-scale military offensive and an invasion and occupation of the full country. I think the ability of Russia to conduct the former is reasonably certain. The ability to successfully conduct the latter is much more questionable. I believe the last estimate I've seen from the US about the amount of force Russia would need for a full-scale invasion is somewhere between 110 and 130 BTGs. So we are still slightly short of that number. Depends how much more reinforcement is still to come into the theatre. And I think that, again, some of the question marks we've seen picked up before. Yes, there are 4 obvious potential axes of operations given their current deployment posture. Gomel-Klamovo on the Belarus-Russia border, Belgorod-Balyuki, north and south of Kharkov, Rostov-Milarovo on the Donetsk-Luhansk front and Crimea. But as Ben has mentioned, I expect at least some of that to be deception operations, and it's unlikely that Russia will attack from where they're currently showing us they're going to attack from. And finally, yes, I think it's important, again, whilst the political objective upside of a full-scale invasion may be obvious to Russia, the military capacity to carry it out successfully is much more questionable and risk a lot of the things Russia really can't afford to get involved in, I think.
James?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think Henry and Ben and Doug have hit the main points there. Russia's given itself options. That's what we talked about. It doesn't necessarily have to exercise all of these. And there is a difference between an invasion and an occupation. And I think that's one of the key things to remember. Forces from the Warsaw Pact that went into Czechoslovakia in '68 were some sources say 500,000. Iraqi freedom in 2003, 200,000-ish, and that was said not to be enough at the time. So to occupy, subdue and pacify a country that is actively resisting, whether they have the capacity to do that at the moment, I think is open to some question. But then that doesn't rule out the invasion option that we've been talking about along some of those axes of advance.
Bastian, you have some questions from our online audience.
Yeah, we have a good dozen or so questions that have come in online. Maybe I can just to stay on that theme for just one more go. If we turn this around a little bit, there's a question from Brigadier General Klaus Wittmann, who's asking about Ukraine's capabilities to defend. If we can elaborate a little bit more about Ukraine's capabilities to defend against a Russian, as he says, full-blown attack. So maybe we can have a domain view on those things as well, and perhaps also a cyber element in the response.
So Ben, could you start, please?
I strongly suspect that the average Russian brigade is considerably more modernized than the average Ukrainian brigade. Ukrainians certainly would fight for their country, desperately so probably, as indeed would many of the civilian populace. But if we look at the last decade's worth of combat experience, Ukraine has combat experience from its defeats in 2014, and then the war since then, which has been a static World War I style trench system. At the same time, Russia has combat experience from a very successful and very sophisticated intervention in Syria. They cycled all their senior officers through that land, air, and Spetsnaz. And certainly towards the end of the war, they were capable of very ambitious core level operations, moving over great distances in the Syrian desert, synchronizing air, land, artillery, manned and unmanned aircraft. And they also served a masterclass in urban warfare by Lebanese Hezbollah, who took part in that. And I suspect they've learned a great deal about modern war from that.
Anyone else want to volunteer on Ukrainian capacities? Nick?
Just on the naval side of things, I would say that one of Ukraine's challenges is that the Ukrainian Navy and naval forces suffered very significantly as a result of 2014 losing a huge amount of the bulk of their capabilities. And now in terms of actual order of battle, the Navy is limited to just one major warship and a small number of just over a dozen or so coastal and patrol craft. There is a process underway with the support of the United States, United Kingdom, Turkey to some extent to aim at rebuilding that, but it is very much in its early stages. So in terms of being able directly to challenge in the naval sphere, it would be a difficulty for Ukraine, and the balance, if you like, in naval and maritime terms compared to 2014 has changed significantly in Russia's favor with the investments as well in terms of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Having said that, in terms of potential areas where there might be naval activity, and particularly amphibious activity, there may be ways in which Ukraine can frustrate any possible plans there might be as far as amphibious landings are concerned, and defending against those. But in many ways, that presents also a problem for Ukrainian forces in terms of the utility of those amphibious forces, the Russian amphibious forces, either to fix and hold, or potentially to distract and complicate Ukrainian defenders.
Thanks very much. In the second row, just over your left shoulder, there's a microphone, I think. Oh, or coming from the front. Great.
Sorry, good morning. Kevin Rowlands from the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Centre. I think we all tend to compartmentalise and all eyes are on Ukraine. But in the West, should we be concerned about the strategic alignment, however informal, between Russia and China?
Mayor Nowens.
I think the statement that we saw between Russia and China is a step towards a greater public sense of alignment that we knew was growing anyway in the last few years. I think in the sense that China now has a public statement on certain views that are important to Russia, and likewise vice versa is of concern. But I still think that integration, at least in the military sense, is more limited than we suspect. And also that when it comes to China's priorities for its own security in the Indo-Pacific region, it will not seek to link those to any action that Russia deems appropriate in its own region. Thank you.
Maybe it's worth adding just one sentence that if you look carefully at that joint statement, the special area of regional concern is essentially the area, as it were, governed by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it's those Central Asian borderlands on which as much cooperation as perhaps tension can arise between China and Russia. Bastian, do you have anything from the online people? I'll have you in a second.
Yeah, they're coming in fast and thick online now. Here the question. So changing themes a little bit. Hypersonic weapons. Could the panel please elaborate on the state of play globally? There are 2 or 3 questions on this. What's the military utility of hypersonic weapons, and how do we look at the current race, as the question goes, to develop these capabilities? I would imagine, Douglas, you want to start on that one, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's a how long is a piece of string answer, really. We could be here all afternoon, but I won't keep you that long. Hypersonic weapons, military utility. I mean, there's obviously military utility if you look at the amount of money that's been spent in this area at the moment. In the case of the 3 main pursuers, if you like, the US, Russia and China, in reverse order, in a sense, China over the past 20 years has poured an enormous amount of money into developing the kind of ground infrastructure that you need to develop these classes of weapons. And we're really talking about two, arguably three kinds of weapons here: hypersonic boost glide vehicles, hypersonic cruise missiles, and aeroballistic missiles, which are air-launched ballistic missiles. In terms of the utility, it stretches from strategic to theatre to arguably tactical. There remains considerable debate as to how far down the road these systems are to being fully employable. Obviously, the Russians have got a hypersonic boost glide vehicle in service in limited numbers in the avant-garde. The Chinese have similarly deployed at least one hypersonic boost glide system. They have an aeroballistic system coming down the pipe. Russia has Kinjal, which comes off a modified MiG-31. The US got multiple programs underway to try and close the gap, if there is indeed a gap, because with the US, it's actually very difficult to know what's going on in the classified world. In terms of other players, France has got considerable capability. It's pursuing a number of options. The UK less so. We kind of downgraded our expenditure in this area in the early 2000s, and we're now trying to play catch up. In terms of the current race, is there a race? Well, there's certainly a race in terms of public perception, but as I say, it's actually quite difficult to determine who's in the lead, partly because an awful lot of this has been carried out in the classified world.
John, thank you very much. And yes, if you could stand up, then, or you don't need to, but.
Larissa, I'm just interested in further thoughts from the panel on the significance of the withdrawal of Russian vehicles from Ukraine's border. And also just wondering what you think Russia will have gained then if they do withdraw vehicles at this stage and troops. Thank you.
Henry?
I start with a certain amount of I'll believe what I see when I actually see proper evidence of it. We've seen this before, not just last year. I think there's a distinction between moving vehicles around and moving troops around and where they end up. In the event that this is what Russia now claims it is, the end of a series of exercises, and we're going to start seeing meaningful withdrawals, particularly of equipment from forward bases, stuff that is going to take a long time to bring back if they want to bring back. I think it is questionable exactly what Russia has managed to achieve of substance that is commensurate with the amount of effort they have gone to in terms of this military mobilization. Is a certain amount of reflection that says that when Russia mobilizes, it does so for multiple reasons, and it will have gained some level of exercise out of this to demonstrate they can do it. But looking at the way both NATO states have reacted and the way NATO have reacted in regard to their support for Ukraine, I think it's questionable how much Russia really has gained in terms of political value. Looking at the negotiations that have gone on, looking at the question marks about that, whether they have really gained a substantial political advantage out of that, I think is something that many people have raised questions about already.
Thanks. Yeah, you and then Robert. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's Stephen Fiddler from the Wall Street Journal. A couple of a more general question, perhaps. Since you last did this exercise a year ago, what are the most significant developments that you've seen? What are the changes in the balance, the military balance, China and Russia, but elsewhere too, both in terms of capabilities and in terms of strategy?
James?
I think John's address in terms of strategy highlighted some of the key ones. That's the development of these minilateral institutions or furtherance of them. You know, AUKUS is a recent example of a security partnership that can be perhaps viewed in the same way. States are looking at bilateral developments. They always have in the Asia Pacific as a way of securing defense cooperation. Of course, that region doesn't have the same alliance structures that it has in Europe. In Europe, we've seen more bolstering of the cohesion between NATO allies. We've seen since 2014, and this is paradoxical given the Russian position that NATO needs to withdraw from its borders, that presence developed after 2014 with the enhanced forward presence. Those states since that year have increased their military spending. They've increased their capability development. And that's just a furtherance of that long-standing trend. And states' procurement reactions continue elsewhere. We've seen, for instance, Malaysia start to go through the process of procuring air defense radars. That was in the year that China flew aircraft down in such a way that then caused the Malaysian Air Force to scramble from, I think, Sabah. More broadly, in terms of capability development, I think, again, we highlighted some of those issues. It's the threat from systems that already exist that are used in novel ways, and the development of high-powered networking capabilities that allow states at the higher end of military capability to pool all their resources militarily and act quicker and hopefully more decisively from their point of view than their adversary.
Thanks. Mayor, might you want to add something on China?
Sure. I think that point on minilaterals is a really important one, because from Beijing's perspective, what it is most concerned about is, of course, not just facing the United States, but facing the United States plus allies and partners in the region, as well as potentially those from outside of the Indo-Pacific region as well now, as European countries have published some European countries have published Indo-Pacific strategies. So, for example, with regards to a Taiwan or a South China Sea contingency, China now needs to be concerned about more than just what the US military will do, but also, of course, what Japan will do, what Australia will do following AUKUS. And how China will respond to this from Beijing's perspective, a heightened threat perception in the next year, I think is something that we should be watching very closely, in addition to, of course, the political developments within Beijing leading up to the 20th Party Congress.
Thank you. Robert Fox.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Carrying on AUKUS, please. Where are we really going with this, given what we've seen with the limited capacity to build extra, say, Virginia or Astute, and the paucity of nuclear construction experience in Australia? And could it all change with a change of government in Canberra, which is likely?
Well, on the technical bits, maybe I invite Nick Childs to come in. You might want to also look at some of the things that Ewan Graham has recently written for us on the technical issues, especially the capacity of Australia to train up for being able to properly run any nuclear propulsion submarines. But Nick.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Robert. Yes, I think you point up the fact that as far as this is concerned, the arrangement and the challenge, particularly in terms of submarine capabilities, presents to some extent both significant opportunities for the parties, but also significant challenges. And it is going to be a case very much of in the time available, the partners together being able to work their way through this minefield of what is the right strategic partnership. To some extent, what is the submarine design, both capability and where is the optimal design? What will be the build strategy in terms of being able to deliver this, and areas around scheduling. And as I say, this presents challenges for all, but also potentially some opportunities in terms of scale and cooperation. So this will unfold, I think, in a way that will be perhaps not quite as originally set down in black and white. There may have to be some compromises in terms of particularly timetables, perhaps issues around build strategy. For the US and the UK, yes, there are, as you suggest, major concerns, not least their own top priority national programs, both to deliver a ballistic missile submarine, new generation ballistic missile submarine, and their own national ambitions to deliver an attack and tactical submarine capability with relatively limited resources. On the other hand, in the round, in terms of what we were talking about, and James in particular was talking about the Mayor, the coalescence of requirements for cooperation and looking at minilateral solutions to the challenges ahead. The addition of this a capability that is centered on Australia could present opportunities for both. I'm not an expert on the Australian political side of things, but at the moment, in broad terms, this agreement does seem to have political support, but there's absolutely no question that for all the parties concerned, the only way to deliver this will be sustained political will and commitment over a significant amount of time.
Mayor.
If I could just add to Nick's excellent point that in addition to modernizing its conventional capabilities, China is of course also seeking to dominate and lead globally in areas of emerging technologies. And here AUKUS's other focus on how to cooperate on innovation of emerging technologies, I think does could prove helpful in pooling resources and talent within like-minded countries to remain competitive in spaces like artificial intelligence and quantum and other emerging technologies that Beijing is also focusing on. So perhaps also a different aspect to AUKUS that we don't focus on too much.
Bastian, any questions from the online group we should look for?
Yeah, there are a couple in here. I'll pull out two that are going in slightly different directions, if that's all right, John. One perhaps inspired by our holding slide here on the strategic balance in the Arctic as climate change opens it to navigation, whether we could comment on that. I propose that Nick, you'll start on that. And I'll throw in a second one from Byron Callan on major new combat aircraft programs. Douglas, if we look across the board, Tempest, FCAS, Turkey, Japan, Korea, Rafale recent successes, Byron's question is really, do you see any underlying changes in that market and in the activities of the major players in the combat air environment?
Maybe Doug first on air and then to Nick on high north and navies.
I think the first thing you've got to say is the French have had an extraordinary 12 months in terms of the sales of Rafale. I mean, very impressive, extraordinary order book. They have a problem, but it's a fantastic problem to have, is that they now got to figure out how to produce the aircraft at the rate they need. There's a big step up in terms of rate. The other European question that Byron alludes to is the Franco-German-Spanish combat aircraft program and the UK-Swedish-Italian program, Tempest, as it sometimes is generally known in public. And I think we've got some way to go before that is all settled down. Whether those two constructs are actually the final constructs that put aircraft into production, I think is an open question. In that sense, I look back at the kind of the late 1970s, early 1980s merry-go-round of fighter aircraft projects that eventually resulted in the Europeans producing three very capable combat aircraft out into the 1990s, and the aircraft that we now see fielded now. The challenge for the Europeans, less so for the US because it's got such a big domestic market, is that whereas previously some of the countries that we'd have looked to have sold to, they now have their own programs, and those programs are pretty impressive in some ways. I think perhaps one signpost for the future is the current involvement of Japan on the propulsion side of Tempest. I think is an interesting signpost, and I wonder if that relationship may yet deepen. There are challenges, but the Japanese bring some very interesting technologies to the table. So I think that will be interesting to see how that develops. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Nick.
Thank you. On the Arctic and its strategic significance, I think it is a case that it is rising up the league table of strategic concerns, and that's a reflection of why we have the wall chart this year on Arctic security dynamics, in large part driven by key factors around the much heralded anticipation of the opening up of possibilities of greater exploitation of resources and potentially issues like new sea routes in the longer term. In terms of strategic capabilities at the moment, there's no doubt that Russia, as perhaps the most significant military Arctic power in terms of what capabilities it can field there, and the efforts that it has been undertaking to improve those capabilities, represents in some ways the main player in the region. But part of the drivers behind its own developments are the fact that this opening up and greater interest also raises key issues of key vulnerabilities as far as Russia is concerned, not least the fact that a huge amount of its strategic capabilities, including its naval-based strategic forces, are based around in this area out of the Kola Peninsula. So that represents a driver for it. The issues are around interpretation of just how far it has gone in terms of its capability development that represents genuine defensiveness, or is more to do with coerciveness. And I think that is part of where you see other players engaging much more in the region to if you like, establish their own interests, and you see that with NATO and US focusing more on relearning capabilities in that region, and also to some extent investing in certain capability deficits. For example, the US trying to move forward as fast as possible in terms of delivering icebreaker capabilities. The issues is how this dynamic unfolds in a way that, if you like, maintains stability and deterrence, and doesn't, if you like, raise concerns about potential misinterpretation and a potential greater instability. And another part of that in the longer term that can't be avoided in terms of the strategic significance of this region is the growing interest of other players, and not least amongst those is China, and how Chinese both interests and presence in that region may or may not develop in the future, I think is a key to that dynamic, not least the Russia-China dynamic, but more generally in how others perceive what this represents in terms of a strategic area of interest.
Nick, thanks. We'll take one or two more questions from the floor, unless there's online, rather. Bastian?
Yeah, there's a rich menu here coming in, so thank you to all of those who are contributing questions online. Let me pull out two defense economics questions, and they're different, but Fenella, I'm going to put them both to you. One is whether you can speak a little bit more on what the impact of inflation might mean on defense budgets, and in particular the defense investment part of defense budgets, and where perhaps cuts might go. And then the second part, the second question is on Russia, namely whether Russia will be able to continue to afford a modernization program in its current posture, or whether its economy will put limits to the financial resources that can be put in that direction. So inflation and defense investment, and the sustainability economically of Russia's defense modernization program.
Thanks, Bastian. So on the first point, in terms of where the impact of inflation might affect the investment part of the defense budget, and it does sort of tie in with Russia as well, because defense industry has had to contend with commodity prices increasing significantly. I think there's a 25% in the price of metals for shipbuilding and those kind of aspects. So that creates the pressure where you have those committed programs already, and those will become more expensive. You can guard yourself against certain risks of cost increases or exchange rate fluctuations, but the more protracted that is, the greater pressure there will be on these investment programs as they come through. And then because again, if I move on to Russia, wages there are indexed. So it means that making cuts to personnel or at the moment operational spending might be quite difficult. So that then creates the squeeze elsewhere in the budget. In terms of Russia's ability to continue to afford to invest in defence, the current defence spending plan in their draft law is fairly flat to 2024. But we did see in 2021 that if the fiscal profile of Russia improves, so when the real GDP growth was upgraded for 2021, they increased their defence budget. So it is quite fiscally led. So if we start to see any improvement in Russia's economy, then they will adjust that profile upwards. And then you have the issue in Russia that there are basically 4 measures of the defence budget, depending on the core budget, total defence expenditure, and whether you use market exchange rates or PPP. So that kind of, if you use total expenditure at the PPP rate, you end up with a defence budget that makes more sense in terms of the capability that Russia is able to invest in and bring to the party. Thanks.
Many thanks. Well, it's 11:30. We promised an hour. We've delivered an hour. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. There are examples of the Russian military modernization dossier out there, which we don't think is in a material way out of date and worth examining in detail for those of you who are interested in the strategic problem du jour. Otherwise, of course, all of our experts are available here afterwards for any follow-up questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.